Well, good morning, everyone. Appreciate the opportunity to meet with you today. I was speaking with Charles yesterday. It says like he and maybe some of the other folks from your group were able to get to the WUI conference in Reno. I was not able to make it, but I checked with him yesterday. And essentially what I'm going to cover with you today will be very similar to what was presented in Reno. And I just double checked with him to make sure that was still a good fit for your group. So I'm going to just dive right in and scoot right along. I know your time's valuable, and we'll try to leave a little time for Q&A at the end. Anything else I ought to know or need to address before we get started?
I think you should be good. You should have a co-host, right? So
okay, good. So let me get in and do sharing. All just a little different, right? Where you find them. Oh, there we go. Okay, can you see that?
Yep, we got it.
All right, very good. Okay, so we'll go from beginning here. All right, so I think the biggest thing for all of us, right, is that I've been at this a long time. I've listened a little bit with your group. I know some of the folks from your fire safety council, and you have there's a high level of IQ there, a lot of experience, and you and I both understand that we've had wildfire and we've had losses to wildfire for a lot longer than any of us have been around. But what I think we're responding to is an unprecedented loss of environmental property and also changes in our environment. And it is unprecedented. I think that's why we're reacting to it so strongly. We did something similar with losses to life and property on the inside of structures back through what was reported in America Burning. And I think we're hitting a similar time period here. We have another set of unacceptable and unprecedented losses. We just held a federal commission, and it's probably going to take us, kind of like that one, about 5 decades to really get into this. So the couple of things I'll just point out here to make the case as we move ahead. So we know that a lot of these fires are certainly human caused, but those are up quite a bit. And we're also not just seeing more fire activity, but we're seeing a higher density of loss of structures per fire. And it's not surprising. We'll see that we've had an increase in development in those spaces. So why is this happening now? It's really a combination of 3 things leading to a 4th one. Significant increase in fuel load, as you all know. We'll take a couple look at some pictures here. Especially since World War II, at least in the US, more development in fire-dependent landscapes. And then amongst all the things that we talk about in climate change, and I am no climate scientist. Oh, and just a quick correction, I am an ABD on my dissertation. That's in there, but sometimes it gets missed. So I don't want to pretend I've got a PhD when I don't. But got about halfway through the dissertation. But on of the parts of climate change that really are explanatory for me as a fire practitioner is this concept of increasing vapor pressure deficit, and we'll look at that in a little bit. And then those things taken together are just increasing the exposure that we have. And we're focused obviously on wildfire, but this issue, especially the insurability side of this issue, covers all those changes in climate. Fire used to be a rounding error in this space, and it's not anymore. It's becoming pretty significant, but it still doesn't overcome those changes from convective storm, flooding, hurricane, etc.
Hey, Frank, sorry.
Yes.
Just we're seeing the presenter view. Is there a way just to do it to where we're not, if it's too much trouble?
I apologize here. I did hook up
no problem.
the screen the other day.
I know it's hard with Zoom, and it's not that big of a deal, but if it's just, then we could see the full screen of the presentation.
Let's see if I can.
I believe in the display settings tab at the top of the screen, there's a drop down arrow.
Yeah.
And if you do swap presenter view and slideshow, that may.
How's that?
There it is.
Very good. Okay. Thank you very much. Can't see that off my end. All right. So you should see 2 pictures of Yosemite Valley here. Just making sure. Okay. Very good. And so, you can see the difference now. Obviously, since this picture on the right was taken, we have actually had a fire go through there. It's removed some of that. But you can see the difference in the density here. I mean, and this is what we're dealing with. You know, here's another one. This is what we're dealing with. And it's not just in the Western US, it's in the US, it's in a lot of other places. And it's unintended consequences of exactly what we asked of our fire services 100 years ago, was to, you know, let's get these wildfires out. This timber's a national treasure. We're coming out of an industrial age. You know, went through some world wars. And so with the best of intentions, we ended up overloading the fuels. Another one here, this comes out of the census data. It was also included recently in a good IDHS publication. But you can see, especially in California, this increase in development into the fire dependent landscapes, which we said was another contributing factor to, you know, why now. This is some data on vapor pressure deficit. You can see that it changes over time, but it's also pretty clear we're on a trend here. And if you'll take note, you'll see this one, just kind of put this marker in your head here. This last data point on this particular slide is 2020. When we try to project increases in fire activity based on emissions and vapor pressure deficit, this is what Page Williams and Winslow Hansen worked to come up with. And I don't think that slide title is overdone. I'm not much for making grandiose statements, but it is a little spooky when you look at what those projections would be. And on the previous slide, the upper end of that trend for vapor pressure deficit was right here. And so you can see what those projections would indicate for future fire loss. That is a spooky scenario. For the older fire folks in the crowd here, and these 10 standard firefighting orders, along with some other ones that have built over the years. But you know, a couple of the really important ones talk about basing your actions on current and expected fire behavior and fire weather. And so if you were to just extend that lesson out past a couple of operational periods and look into the future this way, in the absence of some better information, this is what we need to be preparing. And it's significant. So I would love to say that I had great foresight and, you know, saw all this coming, but I'm probably one of the later arrivals to really understanding what's been going on, even though it's my profession. There's a little bit of embarrassment in that, but I want to be honest about it. It probably wasn't until around 2015, 16, I couldn't square what I was seeing anymore with what I knew out of the past. And so it felt like we were seeing and experiencing new things. One of the ones that happened was in Mammoth Lakes, as Nick mentioned. That was my last assignment. In the space of a week, I had some property owners pass our defensible space inspection, probably not that dissimilar to what you have there. Passed that early in the week, and then were non-renewed from their insurance carrier before the week was up. And understandably, they called me, and I, the supposed fire professional, could not answer the question for them on how could they pass the fire services defensible space inspection, but then have their insurance non-renewed for too much wildfire risk. That's what really got me started down this road. So there's also this disconnect between conditions on the ground and pricing. We'll look into that, a reason for that in a minute. But, and to be clear in the background, I'm not trying to solve the insurance industry's problems, but I recognize that without helping them solve those, we'll never actually solve the ones we need, which is to get property owners at scale to implement and maintain the type of mitigations that we have enough science behind us to really dig into this. And so we do need to get those aligned. And then at some point, we've got to settle around a core set of mitigations that make the most difference, have the best return on investment, if you will. There's a lot of good effort out there. I'd like to say that I feel like our public policy and our academic research is kind of in a state of ventricular fibrillation right now. There's a ton of well-intentioned, desperate activity to get it right. And yet we're still not generating an effective heartbeat where we are all hitting on the same cylinders, same message all the time from all angles. And so we've got to get better alignment there. And I would just say that we can't suppress, regulate, or price our way out of the situation we have with the existing inventory of homes in the WUI. We can only mitigate our way out. That's the only path forward. So I think initially when I looked at this, it was pretty clear that all the stakeholders wanted the same outcome, that we don't want any losses, life or property losses to the peril of wildfire. And so from my perspective, working from the community out, the way you do that, especially with the existing inventory, is really three things. You do retroactive hardening on the structure itself, a lot of what you're discussing in your agenda. Out from that, you're doing defensible space. We're getting closer to having good alignment on those zones, but essentially it's reducing fuels on the property, the parcel that structure is on, that distances vary. And then in those first two, a lot of the things that we're doing are based on ember exposure and lower intensity, lower duration exposure to the structure. That could be from vegetation immediately adjacent. It might be some things on the deck, etc. But that set of mitigations that are really aimed at embers and low duration, low intensity heat flux get completely overwhelmed when you start burning structures next to structures. And in sustained winds, call it 40 miles an hour, the amount of heat flux and the duration that the structures burn completely overwhelm the typical hardening and defensible space mitigations. And so you have to layer on community level mitigation, which we'll discuss in a few minutes. But this is not actually what we did. This is really hard work, as fire safe councils know. What we all kind of did was we went to those things that are familiar and kind of easy for us. So we started, you started to see wild fluctuations in behavior in the market with insurance. We started to see maps come out to define things, and we had static hazard maps, which were the best things at the time. But risk is dynamic, especially if you're going to talk people into doing a bunch of mitigation. You have to find ways to recognize that in any mapping tools. And as you're starting to see now, not so much in the general obligation municipal bond ratings yet, I think that's still to come. But mortgages, reinsurance, primary insurance, those are all topics in your community, just as it is mine. So it feels like we're missing this mitigation policy effort. We have to get that accomplished at scale on the ground, or conditions aren't going to change the outcomes we're facing. You can read this faster than I can read it to you. But I do believe if we don't get this resolved, the cascading financial consequences are going to occur long before we get into our next Lahaina, next Marshall, next Smokehouse, etc. So we need to do both. We have to get what's effective on the ground, and we have to get it recognized in the financial markets that are transferring risk. And that way the property owner is getting the same information no matter which direction they look. I'm sure you, as with a lot of the people I'm working with, we use the we word a lot, and we realized, well, who are the we? This, I think, is we could call it sort of the ultimate leaderless group exercise. Nobody owns this space outright. It's a combination that the WUI burns as a system. And so I like to draw this distinction. We've had terrestrial sciences and oceanographic sciences a lot longer than we've had coastal sciences. But we eventually realized that the complexity where land and water meet could not be adequately explained predictably, socially, environmentally, biologically, meteorologically, by extending oceanographic science onto the into the coastal areas, or extending terrestrial sciences into the coastal areas, that those weren't sufficient And I think we're just now figuring out that we need to look at the WUI in the same way. This can't be land use managers and policy experts shouting over the fence, if you will, into communities and saying, hey, if you would just fix things on your side of the fence, we wouldn't have these problems. And we can't have urban planners shouting over the same fence back out at their partners in the land use spaces that, hey, if you would just solve your wildfire problem, we wouldn't be burning down communities. We have to get past that disconnect. This happens as a system, and so we need to treat it that way. This is a group of people. There's a lot of other people we're working with, but these are the ones that we've really dug into with what I'm sharing with you today, and are giving us, some strong thumbs up that they think we're on the right path. So real quickly, this graphic comes out of several years of talking with stakeholders in this space. So insurers, reinsurers, cap modelers, actuaries, policy experts, fire practitioners, insurance regulators. And so we've had 2 convenings, and what we came up with is that this continuous improvement cycle, which is really what it is what everybody wants. They want the best fire science on heat transfer, driving the best property loss cap modeling, which would drive the valuation prioritization of risk mitigations. That defines the architecture for pre-incident data collection and sharing. That actually, once we get that into some GIS layers, we can pop into CWPPs and some other tools, will give situational awareness to first responders, actually help them be better at what they do. But the real magic in this process comes up when we get into post-fire reconstruction. Because we have to know what mitigations were present or absent on the ground, deconflict those from any defensive actions by responders or homeowners, to really determine what the efficacy is of these various mitigations. And then once we know that, we redefine the best science, and you're into a continuous improvement cycle. But what we found was there was 2 reasons we couldn't do this yet. The first is we didn't have alignment around a core set of mitigations that matter. That's what that MTM means. We have some things that are close. We have NIST's hazard mitigation methodology, wildfire prepared home from California Department of Institute for Business and Home Safety, and the Safer from Wildfire guidelines from the California Department of Insurance. They're similar, they're related, but they're not a common core set yet, that at least from the risk transfer and modeling side are uniform enough to use interchangeably. The second thing is that the risk transfer industries don't have any loss experience with these mitigations. They don't know how effective they are yet. So we realized that to get to this space, there were really 5 enabling tasks that we had to get to. They would require data pilot. We're doing some of this work down in Rancho Mission Viejo right now. And once we can close this, then we believe that we'll have this closed system that really will define how we improve this over time. But we have to come up with a core set of mitigations, which I think we're very close to. We point to the IBHS wildfire prepared home. We needed to have a structure spread model with structures as the primary fuel type. I'm still not aware of one. Well, I'm aware of one for sure, and a second one that I know is being worked on. Dr. Gollner and his fire lab up in UC Berkeley. Dr. Hussam Mahmood is the one that I think is on the right track presently. Ultimately, we'll end up with a few models would be best, but currently I'm only aware of one, and I'm encouraged by that, and we'll discuss it a little bit today. We need a WUI response rating. Your fire departments in your area have some kind of a PPC score from the Insurance Services Organization that relates to their capability to respond to structure fires, interior fires. But we don't have something for the outside, for the wildland response. And so we created something new for that with some practitioners so that they can tell the difference when a community has invested in the right tools, equipment to be effective in this space, to disrupt fire pathways. We'll discuss in a minute. Didn't exist. We need a WUI data commons. And this is really important in this space because it does burn as a system. And without a systemic level of situational awareness in communities, we really don't know what the risk is. And the insurers by nature, one, because they're competitors, and two, because there's some antitrust laws that get in the way, they don't have a common risk picture. And so ironically, you can't know your total risk unless you know your adjacent risk. Right now, they don't know that. So we're trying to help them out with that, with setting up a WUI data commons. And the last one is figuring out the barriers to social implementation and maintenance of these mitigations at scale. If any of you are doing inspections and trying to convince people to do that, you know that it comes with various levels of support and disapproval. But we have to figure out how we get this stuff done at scale. We have to change conditions on the ground or the outcomes won't change. So in this graphic, we're just trying to, we'll dig into this in a minute, but trying to show these, our approach is to look at this, as I said earlier, as a system, kind of like you have coastal sciences, we're looking at kind of taking this WUI space as a system. And we see it as a system of 3 fire pathways that we're setting out to disrupt concurrently. So the first is the vegetation fire pathway at about a half to a quarter mile outside of communities. The second is vegetation to structure. This is really about the transition of fire from vegetation to structures through direct flame contact and radiant heat. And then, as you all know, concurrent to this, we have millions of members flying over the top of everything, landing in the structures. And so we need a structure to structure fire pathway separation or disruption strategy as well. So just the taxonomy on this real quick. Our approach is to say that a WUI community is any collection of 100 or more structures where in 50% of the cases or more, the structure separation distance is less than 70 feet. And that's just kind of a fancy way of saying that the homes are close enough under conflagration conditions and winds that they can become the primary fuel type for structure to structure spread. It's not a wildfire anymore. It's a good old-fashioned conflagration. The second one in the interface, this is a little bit new for folks, but we're talking about the urban interface areas actually being a band, or think of it as a donut. It goes about 100 feet out into the vegetative landscape. It'll carry fire, and about 2 layers of homes deep inside of that community. And that is the space where your initial response and some fuel treatments and really thoughtful hardening can do a lot to protect the rest of your community. And then the last of these fire pathways is this sort of sphere of influence. And we're looking at not the intensity that fire comes into the community, but the speed that it comes into the community. We'll explain why in a couple of slides here, but essentially, we don't think we can keep fire out of a community underneath those conditions. It's going to come into the community. So what can we do to slow it? Because by slowing the approach, we can get 2 things done. We can get more evacuation done, and it gives us more time to get scarce resources, especially IA resource, initial attack resources, at the right and most critical areas of fire coming into a community. And I'm going to zip through this part real quick. So unfortunately, thank goodness to high security here at Cal Poly, I can't get this live link to work. So you've got a static picture that I'm going to walk you through, but this is it's an interface dashboard. And what this does is we're using a minimum time travel output from Flam Map, and I think that's also in Farsight. I don't use Farsight much myself. But essentially, we're setting ignition lines at about a half to a quarter mile out of WUI communities. And I think you could walk to any of your communities, usually you can, and you can ask them, hey, where do you get your really strong dry winds from? And usually they'll kind of throw their arm out in an arc. And they usually don't point to 360 degrees and say it's from all angles equally. Usually any community can probably narrow down where they get historically those strong dry winds, then a 90 to 120 degree arc. And if anybody's not sure, you can go back and pull the data up. It's pretty easy to call that out. And so you set these start lines within that arc of conflagration type winds. Usually they're pressure gradient winds. And so you look at which of these, so each of these pathways, we know those will all fill in and give us the normal fire map outlook that we see. It looks like an amoeba of some type. But embedded in that, unless it's a really homogeneous fuel, you have these runs that go in the lighter fuels, and then those fill in together. So we run these simulations, and you can run them by the tens of thousands, and you see where they start to coalesce. And then what you do is say, okay, which of these pathways actually make their way into a community? And so you can see down here where my cursor's at, this is down at Clear Lake. You can see there's a couple of main advance routes that come in off those start lines. And kind of like when it's raining, right? You can put rain all through the mountain range, but by the time you get it down into the flats, most of that runoff is kind of coalescing, it's starting to align a bit. And what we have seen in the modeling, we need to bear more of this out, is regardless of where the start lines go, the confluence into communities starts to approach around 70%. So as we know, weather and topography, wind speed have a lot to do with where that goes. So what you're seeing in here, these little things that look like Band-Aids, can you see those? Kind of, okay. Those are essentially splats, and there's some literature on this from Mark Finney and others using strategic placement of fuel treatments. So rather than try to do these sort of Maginot Line massive fuel breaks that are extremely hard to maintain and are really designed to fight fire from, if you can get resources on there, they certainly can do that well. And in the right conditions, they will stop fires. But from an ember standpoint and conflagration conditions, you know, if these fires are jumping over 8-lane highways, they're certainly going to go over for fuel breaks. So the idea is to put strategically placed treatments along the fire pathways that have the highest speed, really just to slow things down. And again, that slowing gets us two things. And by the way, the green here on this slide, the darker the green, the more time has been bought, or the more delay there's been before the fire gets into the community. And we think that, I mean, and the amount of treatment you're doing in terms of acres is a fraction. And it's less than 10% by far of what you would do in kind of traditional large scale fuel treatments. So I apologize, I can't do any more on that because it's a static slide, but that's kind of my drive-by of what that would do, and we can manipulate that to look at where you get your best treatments. This is a grossly simplified slide. I'll probably just won't spend a lot of time on here, but you can see that we've looked at the capacity and capability within each of the three fire pathways. I mean, it's one thing to have a bunch of fire engines, right? But different types of engines have different value in the three fire pathways. And so we want to make sure that we capture that. We look at the different types of crews that are available, types of equipment and resources that are available. And again, this is grossly simplified, but essentially we drop that into some tools to look at how these resources are laid out. So this is an example from up in Contra Costa County. This essentially be battalion boundaries in that area. This is an overlay that looks at housing density. You know, so if you're sort of scrolling back and through, you can get an idea of what those look like. And then this one is the breakdown of equipment, where it's at in locations that have stations. So you get an idea of the distribution of your resources in that area. And then lastly, this is your response time, your travel time. And so we need all of that information to give communities an idea, and people evaluating communities and their ability to be resilient to wildfire. They need to have this kind of response information. How long does it take to get there? What kind of resources? What capacity? What is their capability? What's their depth if there are multiple incidents? So real quickly, to kind of sum that up, this approach looks at where fire will come into the community, what kind of ground component and embercast it will have. That's all available in modeling that we have today on the vegetation side. The resilience on the entry points has to do with the structure spread model, which I'll get here in just a minute. Your response from firefighters, type of equipment they have, their response time, and the command relationships. Two things that get overlooked a lot is, having multiple units from the same organization respond, same radios, same training, same command structure. They're going to be more efficient than if we have, in a busy fire siege, we'll see what we call, the rainbow strike teams all up and down the state. And they do a great job, but they certainly, they'd be thrown together ad hoc. They may not know the local area. So different types of resources will have a different impact on the outcome. I'm just trying to make that visible. So looking at the structure to structure model, we kind of in our head, we just sort of, we see a community and fire moves through the community, and then we look and see what's left. What Dr. Mahmood is doing out at Colorado State University is he's taking that, but he's using something called graph theory. It's a type of propagation model that's been around for a long time. And so in graph theory, you talk about states of things as nodes, and then the ways that those states get transferred to other nodes, those are called edges or ways, pathways. If you think about COVID, right, we know that you transfer a virus, and being close to someone for a long time without masking and no immunization is a great way to transfer. Those are all ways to transfer a virus. Heat, essentially convection, conduction, radiation, direct flame contact. Those are the edges between nodes. And so when we start looking then at, all right, well, if we know that there's really only a finite ways that you transfer heat, and we understand how the heat is transferred, then in each of those three, we're focusing right now on the structure to structure, but in each of those three fire pathways, it's pretty simple. We're just trying to defeat the propagation of heat so that it keeps moving. So in this example, this on the left-hand side is observed damage from the campfire. And you'll see that nearly everything is either it survives or it doesn't. Usually when structures start in those types of conditions, they will burn to completion unless it's disrupted by defensive action. So on the left, you'll see that it's pretty much red and blue. On the right is Dr. Mahmood's model, and you see a lot more color variation because this is relative vulnerability. But what you really want to look at is just let your eyes follow the blue in both slides. And what you see is that Dr. Mahmood's model is starting to predict the structures that survive. Let's see, here's another one here. This is, this would be from the Marshall Fire. And what you'll start to see is the ability of the model to predict what survives is a lot more interesting to us than circling community and saying that's 70 or 80% of it will be gone. Because if we're going to really talk about these individual dots, these homeowners doing mitigations, we have to demonstrate how it affects them, how it affects their vulnerability, not just the community as a whole. Picture says 1,000 words. This is a little community down in Chile, Botania, I think is the right way to pronounce it. I realize I was pronouncing it wrong. And this is what it looks like. This looks like about 70 or 80 structures, really tightly packed together on top of a flat plateau, surrounded by heavy fuel. I was able to look at Google Maps and take a look at what the fuel loading was around here. To the best of my knowledge, that's the best example I've seen yet. And this is one of 16 pilot communities down there that received some guidance on mitigations, a little bit of support financially, and a small amount of kit to do the work. But I was so impressed with this, I'm going to take a small research team down there the week of April 15th. And we're going to dig into what were the fire conditions that were present when they came into this community, what were the mitigation prescriptions that they were advised to do, and what was the compliance with getting the mitigations done. There were 16 pilot communities. I think we're only going to have the time to look at maybe 5, but this will absolutely be the first one we look at because it demonstrates it could be done. You can look at that ash on there. You can look at the slope. You can look at the other too far out to see needle freeze and stuff, but this fire did not creep its way through here. this thing was making good time. And there was obviously a ton of ember wash on it. So to wrap up here, I would just say that it feels to me like we're at the end of the beginning, lifting a little Winston Churchill sign. But we need to stop admiring and putting more decimal points on the problem, and we need to start getting conditions change on the ground around the structures at scale. Until that happens, we'll just continue to have these. There won't be any change in the outcome if changes on the ground don't proceed it. We've got environmental and economic calamities here, without our permission. And I would just say we all have got to start moving with an appropriate sense of urgency. I am going to be curious to see what happens with both the secondary mortgage market, Fannie and Freddie, and with the municipal bond ratings. If we've got insurers leaving our communities because they can't figure out the risk to the properties whose taxes are the primary way you service the debt on municipal bonds, it just seems like at some point there has to be a reckoning there. And for Fannie and Freddie, who are adopting or bringing in, they buy up these mortgages and the properties are the collateral for mortgage-backed securities. What starts to happen when they have tens of millions of properties in fire-dependent landscapes? And insurability is now a question. It's an annual question where their commitment is a 20 and 30-year note that they have in these fire-dependent landscapes. So I think we've got more economic crisis on our way. And then, like the people in Botania there, we don't have to just sit around and cross our fingers and hope for the best. If we can get aligned around a core set of effective mitigations, inform that Kaizen, that continuous improvement cycle, then we can intentionally have results like we saw on the slide previously. But it's going to take commitment. It's going to take time, probably. It's going to be decades. This isn't going to go away soon. We got to commit, just like we did on the interior structure fires. And then I don't usually recommend a lot of things. People will find their own reading material and things, but this is a book, John Valiant, I think, is the author. If you were going to try to get your arms around this problem and I had to recommend one resource, I'd have you read that book. You can do it on audio too, so you don't have to flip through all the pages. So I'll stop there, and so I got through here soon enough, so we got some time for questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Frank. Very great presentation. Anybody have questions for Frank?
Yeah, Frank, thank you for that presentation. That was really, really good, really mind-opening. I'm kind of pondering what are my major takeaways from listening. And I think number one, it would be we need to have very, very vigorous enforcement of defensible space standards in communities, like very vigorous, and direct resources to home hardening in the wildland-urban interface. Those are my two takeaways. You think that would be the right direction to move?
I'm going to say yes. I think of it like bookends. So I did a lot of inspections, just like a lot of your communities are doing, right? And we have enforcement capability. But if you really look hard at enforcement and its level of effectiveness on actually getting conversions, generally speaking, we're not very good at it. I don't know that we're going to tighten up the bookend on the regulatory side, the enforcement side, enough to change the outcomes. I doubt it. But if we're going to study the science and the physics is about disruption of heat transfer, we got 4 ways you transfer heat, then what we need to do is make sure that we're not diffusing or diluting what people should be doing, which I think is what we're doing right now. We're not all pointing at the same things. But if I get really aggressive as the fire chief in a community, how many fire chiefs we got on here? I think I saw a couple. But generally speaking, you get really aggressive out of the blue on your wildland urban interface space, you probably got about a week or two before the line starts forming outside your door, right? And there's unhappy people, or they're calling your bosses. But what if, in addition to this bookend, the regulatory side, what if on this side was the insurance bookend, or the risk transfer bookend? What if the fire service and the insurance industry were saying the same thing because they were following the same science on the same physics about how you disrupt heat transfer? To me, that's where we need to go. And we're not there yet. We're getting closer, but we need to get, we have to stand up these mitigations, or they just fall out one side or the other. We've got to get aligned around a core set of mitigations. One person's opinion.
Thank you, Frank. That's a great answer. Joan, and then Fred.
Well, I just thought this was a fabulous presentation and my mind is spinning. I guess my question has to do with the blue Band-Aids that you showed, how the heat is transferred. And a question for our team is, what do we know about that in our area? Because that looks like, instead of trying to do everything, that looks like such an efficient way to do it. And then the question I have is, in the community in Peru, do you know yet the mitigations, and was that the type of, I mean, it looked like it was burned everywhere around it, instead of just a path. So I guess you're still learning what it was that they did, and it's not necessarily an application of what you're suggesting of those selective clears.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And what we don't want to do is make the assumption that they did the types of things that we're talking about. So that's part of the reason to go down there. So we'll make sure we know the conditions, the mitigations on the ground, and we'll look at the other communities. Ideally, if it turns out that the mitigations that were in their prescription are close to the ones that we're trying to push stateside, then it's the first time we can point to a community at a community level and say, look, this is a no kidding save in a place I would have lost 99 times out of 100. I would have bet against that community, not knowing what they've done. So that's part of the reason to go figure that piece out. To your first part of your question, there's data supporting this idea, but we've got to dig into it more. Think about it this way. When you look at water coming off of a hillside, especially say like dirt roads, that kind of a thing, if you don't put in water bars, the velocity of the water as it just keeps going and going really gets destructive. But with water bars spread out every so far, you drop the velocity and it has to pick up steam again, right? You're not looking for a reservoir, you're just looking for a way to slow these down. So in a way, think of the splats almost like kind of water bars for routes of fastest travel, not necessarily highest intensity. And so that's the mindset. We still have work to do on that. We're at the front end of it. But all I can say for sure is we can't put Maginot Line moat type fire breaks around all the communities in the US. We can't maintain them, and they do nothing to stop the embers. And so we've got to find a better way to get better return on investment for scarce dollars.
Yeah, and that part just, I think the analogy to water is really fabulous. And I think that's something that I hope we as a Fireside Council and the research that we're engaged in can try to identify here.
Good question. Thank you, Joan. Fred, and then Rob, and then Victoria.
Yeah, question and comment related to the last two people that spoke. But with insurance, it seems like there's still a pretty steep learning curve for them to assess risk. I've seen some pretty bad. I think Rob's my boss for a couple more days, and he's probably seen a couple letters coming in from insurance companies and assessing risk and why they're declining insurance. So I think there's obviously a lot of education that needs to go, focused on that end, and that could take a while, right? So on those blue Band-Aids, are you calling them splats?
Yeah.
what, is there a general size of those that you're thinking might work the best, or is it community based, or?
It seems like from the reading that I've done and the people I've talked to that have been doing, the research in that space, it seems like it's somewhere between like 13 to 30 acres. I mean, I'd have to dig into that a little bit. But they're not, they're not huge, and they have a lot to do with the layers you couldn't see on there. I apologize. Their suitability. So you're looking for places that, are not on a, 200-degree slope. You're looking for things that are going to exit into communities, near roadways. So there's there's environmental concerns for different places. So the splats themselves vary in size, but I don't think they go above about 30 acres. Although in certain conditions, you may see several of them really stacked up in a place that's going to have high speed, just like you'd put in more water bars if you had, some really aggressive landscape and, expected a lot of flow through there. And real quickly to your point on the learning curve, imagine for a minute that you owned a casino, Fred, and I'm your floor manager. And I come in Monday and I tell you, Fred, bad news. It turns out we don't know the probability anymore on 7-card stud. We lost a lot of money this weekend. We don't know the odds anymore. What do you want to do? Well, generally not a good idea to keep playing games of chance you don't know the odds to when you're in the gambling business. But you can only hold your breath so long if that's got a pretty good cash flow for you. So what else do you do? Can you call one of your neighbors that's a competitor and see if they'll help you get your business competitive with them? That's probably not going to work. You can't call the gaming commissioner and tell them you don't know what you're doing. And you can't tell the people that are coming to your place to gamble. So look at it from the insurer standpoint. For the longest time, fire losses to wildfire was very predictable. I mean, you could predict the future by going down a straight road. You could stay in your lane with no view in your windshield, because you could stay in the lanes looking through your rear view mirrors. It was so consistent. But for those three things we said, change in weather, development in fire dependent landscapes, and vapor pressure deficit, or accumulation of fuels, the future doesn't look anything like the past now. So they've gotten lazy on how to do future predictions and collect data. So part of the reason there's a learning curve is that they can't admit to anybody they don't know what they're doing, but they also can't keep playing the game of chance. And we also have these rules of not, sharing too much data, because, you can get into conflict of interest and antitrust situations. So it's going to take some time. That's why the fire service and the insurance industry are really good at having this conversation, because they want the same outcomes, but they don't compete. Neither one of us want any losses, but we don't compete. So I think that's why that's a good relationship to keep fostering.
Great. Rob, and then Victoria.
Yeah, just real quick, Frank, that was awesome. Great information. And then just a comment, just to answer some of the questions that have popped up. So the Moore Foundation work that myself and Max, Anne Marie, that we've been involved in, they're actually using this fire path. Some of the folks in that group are using this fire pathways software modeling. And so we're probably going to be doing the same thing for our RWMP project. So that will happen. But I'll also say that in terms of these field treatments that are designed to disrupt those pathways, we've been doing this for years, but not based on any software modeling, but just based on our boots on the ground assessment of where we need to prioritize field treatment. So I'll speak for Mark Bontillo on the group here, and Nick Elmquist, myself. This is the methodology that we've been using for years, but it was just based on our mental assessment of where we need to put field treatments. So there wasn't modeling that went into it other than our own internal brain modeling. But I would say I'm pretty confident that when we do run these fire pathways, it'll point to the same places where we need to put these field treatments. We've the three of us have been on these wildland fires over the years. And so we know exactly where the heads of those fires came into our interface. And so that's where we've been putting these field treatments. So if you look across the unit fire plan, Fred knows where all these projects are. Some of them are the Fire Safe Council projects, like the grazing treatments, right? And the stuff over in Victoria's neighborhood, and the stuff up on Painted Cave, the stuff behind Montecito, and some of the stuff in the city. Those are all based on our mental perception of where fire is going to hit our interface communities, because we know, exactly as Frank said, we can't create this Maginot line, this medieval wall that surrounds the entire South Coast. That's impractical and would have a lot of environmental damage and would be enormously difficult to maintain, even if you could get it done. So this is anecdotally what we've been doing for many years. And then this is the science that hopefully when we run this on the RWMP and all of our local field treatments, the science will validate what we've already been doing and where we have any gaps, where we need to fill in any gaps.
But that's good. Yeah. And other people have had, pieces of all of this, right? I think we've all been scratching our heads. Like I said, it's the leaderless group exercise. Nobody owns all of it. And so, having these conversations in groups, we're all building on each other's work. So, and I'd be particularly interested to see, if you had any fire experience in any of those treated areas yet. Love to catch up with you on that. All right, I'm sorry, Paul, go ahead.
No, that's fine. Thank you. And thank you, Rob, for interjecting that. Yeah, that's good information. Victoria?
Yeah, I have two questions or two comments. First of all, I saw the story in the New York Times about that community, and Nick sent it out to us. And if you read the New York Times story, it makes this community to be some kind of, they're patriots and forward thinkers and hard workers, and everybody else are sloths who have done nothing to protect themselves in the communities around there. And I hope that in your visit there, you will make some assessment about that. I was sort of skeptical about who got the money and who got the resources, and they were the highest community on the top of the hill. So I had, it did call into question some of the reporting, and the reporter probably didn't know anything about fire science. So I caution you to look at both sides of this coin when you get there. The second thing has to do with the insurance industry. And I think that you are right in some ways that the stakes are different, so that there's an overlap, there's not a conflict, but the reality is the stakes are different because the insurance, the public community and the elected officials want to protect people. I'm sorry, I can't turn that off. It's down the hopefully they'll get it. The public and the elected community and the service community attached to government want to protect people, and that's really their effort, and that's why the Fire Safe Council is so important. Insurance companies want to make money, and that's the bottom line. And they're getting to a point where they're not making the money they used to make, and they're blaming it on fire. And I'm not convinced that that's why they're not making as much money. So I don't want to quite leave them off as being, an equal partner to the public, because they for years have had a vested interest in just making more money for themselves. So I think you can probably tell my perspective from this comment, but I think it needs to be in the public square that the insurance companies are not always our friends, and we need to watch our relationships with them very carefully because of that.
I'd like to ask Rob a question.
Sure, go ahead.
My box says Fran, that's my wife. I'm Jim. Anyway, Rob, you talked about field treatment mitigations and assessments. How do we know if our neighborhood, we live in a high fire zone according to the maps, high hazard. And how do we know if our neighborhood has been subjected to these kind of assessments? And if they haven't, if our neighborhood has not been, how do we get someone to come out and maybe take a look?
Well, you would ask me or Fred or any of my staff. Let me ask you, what neighborhood do you live in?
I'm sorry. Oh, Mission Canyon Heights. Yeah, just above.
Yeah, so
Alamo.
Mission Canyon's had a ton of mitigation work up at the top end of it.
Yes, but not the lower end. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, go ahead.
So that's an example of the fire pathway. So where wind-driven fire is your risk factor, exactly like Frank described. So you don't have a risk factor from normal coastal winds and normal summertime conditions, other than an internal structure fire that somehow transitions to a conflagration. That's a totally different thing. But from a wildland perspective, the risk to Mission Canyon is a sundowner wind. And so we had that. We had the Hayseed fire. We saw what that did. We knew exactly where that hit your community and the type of impact. And so then in 2014, we designed a project at the top end of Tunnel Road and across the top end of Mission Canyon Road to provide that community buffer to slow the fire down next time it comes. Because we can't stop the embers. We can't stop the embers, but we can slow the fire down, because really, honestly, until that community is completely hardened, there will be internal vulnerabilities. That's the vulnerabilities you all have for the things that you do, building wooden fences and buying an old house and not retrofitting it, whatever. And so there's a lot of existing vulnerabilities that are going to take a long time for the homeowners to deal with, right? That's the homeowner's responsibility to deal with those vulnerabilities. So to buy time for fire departments to get resources in there and do structure protection, we created these field treatments, because we knew that in the Hayseed fire, we had 6 engine companies that were burned over because there was no buffer. They had gnarly flame impingement on the leading edge of the neighborhood. So yes, you have a ton of mitigation work that's been done up there, and we're constantly trying to maintain those field treatments.
Our neighborhood specifically is on the west end or the southwest end of Mission Canyon Heights, which faces the ocean. And we're right above Alomar Canyon, where the end of Alomar goes. And I don't know, has there been any mitigation there? Because we're near a very steep slope that goes down to Alomar Street. And I just wondered if there's anything been done on that end of Mission Canyon as a neighborhood. By the way, we've started forming a pod, gotten a number of neighbors together. We're hoping to, have a community application filled out soon and all that. So, but in the meantime, is there anything more we can be doing to check on what field treatment mitigations have been done on our end of Mission Canyon?
Your end is...
Rob, if I could just stop you there for a second, because Frank's going to have to go pretty soon. So we can take this discussion up here afterwards before the week.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay.
Nick, you had a comment?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. I work for Montecito Fire, and prior to the Thomas fire, I don't remember hearing much people having insurance problems, and it's probably has to do with other large fires with lots of structural loss across the state kind of happening simultaneously. But I think what was proven during the Thomas fire, that mitigation that's been very aggressively taken by the fire department and the community over the last several decades, previous fire scars, were all successful in protecting a majority of the homes in Montecito. But after the Thomas fire, what happened is there was a mass exodus of insurers when we just proved that mitigation works, and you could argue is at the least amount of risk, because of chaparral, the way it burns, we probably had several decades where there was little to no risk, and a debris flow, which, new debris basins, expanded channels. And we've tried to compel insurers that, hey man, you're leaving a lot of money on the table, and really your risk is much reduced now as it has been in a very long time, with not much success. So I guess my question to you is, how responsive do you think insurers are when you're communicating with them that this is realistic at community scale?
Yeah, it's a great point, Nick. I mean, it kind of screams at you, right, about the level of disconnect. The last place they should be writing insurance are communities that have been burned around, right? But it's a good example of the disconnect there. So as far as how effective are we being with the insurance industry? And remember, it's not monolithic. There's a couple of really big chunks in there. We're thinking usually about our insurance agent, and then maybe that insurance agent's office, and then maybe they're a broker. But behind all of that is an 800-pound gorilla called reinsurance, global reinsurance. And one of the things that's frustrating right now is that when we have variance off of weather, you know, and you have a big year, but usually you have just minor variations off the weather. It's kind of been our history. You'll have droughts and you'll have, you know, heavy winters and stuff. But generally only every so often. And in the insurance market, the little variations are where the companies themselves cover that through their premiums. But they all buy insurance themselves. The losses are too great for them to cover it on their own, so they buy reinsurance. And because of what's going on with climate across the globe, and you're seeing these the same way I do, you watch the same news I do, I'm sure. Anytime it's too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, global reinsurance is paying, and they're paying big. So oddly enough, one of the things we're going to struggle with is we're going to have communities that go out and do great wildfire mitigation work. But the global cost of reinsurance is going to go up for all kinds of other reasons, have nothing to do with that community. And that reinsurance cost is going to be baked into the bill. That's one of the changes that happened with the Commissioner Laura's some recent adjustments to Prop 103, which I think are the right thing to do. And then the last thing I'll just share too is I heard very clearly, you know, the comment about we have to watch the insurance industry, right? They're used to making a lot more money than they're making now. That's all true. I would just say, I would imagine there's more than one business owner here, and I don't know how long you can run, you know, a business at a structural deficit. And they've had now a number of years where they really have hemorrhaged a lot of cash. Do I think they should go unregulated? Absolutely not. But to deny the fact, I mean, insurance itself in your portfolios, you probably all have retirement portfolios. If you look in there, it wouldn't surprise me if somewhere in your book you've got investments in global reinsurance, or municipal bonds, or secondary mortgage markets. Those have all been pretty stable things. And so if we don't figure out a way to understand the risk and to price it, we won't be able to do lending. And one of the reasons we're doing the pilot work down at Rancho Mission Viejo, this is a planned community that came out of the ground with Chapter 7A, arguably the toughest WUI code in the country. And at the start, that was good enough. But we got a call about a year ago because they couldn't finish the development, because they couldn't sell the buildings, because the buildings couldn't get insured. So if a planned community that's coming out of the ground with a 7A chapter building code isn't getting traction in the insurance industry, you can imagine what everybody else is suffering. So we're trying to make visible to the insurance industry, look, here's how you actually lose these things. And we actually have to do it better than they do. We can't just walk into our city council meeting at Santa Barbara and say, good news, we're only going to lose 5% of our structures. High fives and, you know, pom-poms all the way around, right? Somebody's going to go, well, am I in that 5%? You know, so we have to do it actually a lot better than the insurance industry, but it has to be the same. We have to follow the science, and we have to get aligned. There's just no shortcut to that.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you, Frank. So any other questions for Frank? I know you're on a time crunch, Frank.
Well, I really appreciate the time this morning. Appreciate the work that you're doing. I did not get to meet with your group at Sedgwick recently. supposed to make that with some health issues going on in our family, but I do work with the Moore Foundation on their Wildfire Advisory Council, and I'm familiar with what you're doing there. Santa Barbara sounds intriguing, and I'm glad to see that you're going to do some more work with Trex. I think that's a good process going forward. So you certainly know where to find me if there's anything I can do to support or help what you're doing, and you have a little better idea about what we're doing here at the Bowie Fire Institute. And best of luck to all of you.
Frank, if you could anyway come back, after you go to Peru and give us an update what you discovered out there, that would be awesome. That would be a way you can do that. Yeah,
Maybe have Charles just shoot me. We'll be there 13th through the 20th. And so, sometime maybe in the summer, give us a little time to
that would be great.
data.
Yeah, we'd love to hear what you came up with.
Certainly. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right, everybody. We'll take care.